pond analogy, first thing I want to say about it is an analogy. It is a metaphor. Okay. So you want to not hold it too lightly, but maybe feel into it. Or as you listen, or if you read that chapter in the book, as you read, really let the gist of it, the juice of it penetrate deep rather than try to understand it too intellectually, if that makes sense. But of course, it does have a sort of intellectual structure because that's what analogies do, right? So, or metaphors. So the metaphor is you're standing on the ground in a meadow. Let's say you're on that meadow at night and you're just kind of looking out over the landscape, right? But I want to add one thing to this, and that is you're actually looking at a pond. You're looking at the surface of a pond, all right? And then you have to sort of suspend disbelief at this point when I say, let's just pretend that you actually don't know you're standing in a meadow and you don't realize it's a pond you're looking at. You've just always been looking at the surface of the pond, right? You could almost imagine something like, we know water can be reflective, so you've been looking at a reflection the whole time, not realizing that this is actually a pond you're looking at. Another similar type of analogy would be you've had the VR goggles on and you've been experiencing a virtual reality. You don't realize there's a reality outside of it. So that's how this analogy functions. You're looking at the surface of the pond, and the way I approach this in the book is I kind of explain that what you've taken to be truth based on that, and this is just because of the way our minds function. We're analytical and we try to look for patterns and we try to understand identity, like who am I and who are you and how do we relate and so forth. But the analogy on this pond description is that all those shards of light on the surface of the pond, because we're going to say this is a rippling pond. This night or this lifetime tends to be a little breezy. There's wind blowing across the surface of the pond, and it's kind of rippling around, and there's a full moon above. But again, let's say you didn't know that, right? You only know there's the surface of the pond, and the pond's been turbulent your whole life, right? The analogy of the turbulence is sort of like the ego function, or all the thoughts that are kind of pushing and pulling us around a lot of the time, and self-doubt and fears and psychological fears and these sorts of things that tend to preoccupy our mind, and even anxiety, things like that. These are the ripples that are causing those shards of light to dance around kind of chaotically. Now, of course, those shards of light really are reflections of the moon, but we don't know that. We haven't looked up from the surface of the pond. So we just know there's these shards of light dancing and flashing around that seem to be in some kind of concert with the wind and the breezes and so forth, which would be the conditions of our life. But it's a little chaotic. It's hard to know what's actually going on here. But what we do, because the way our mind functions, we sort of put ourself at the center of everything. I'm separate from everything out there. I'm the center of it. I'm the center of my life. I have to navigate everything and keep everything at a distance. And then some things are more interesting. I pull them closer. Other things I tend to push away, whether they're thoughts or people or experiences or memories. So we're always doing this sort of management. But on the surface of this pond, the analogy would be that's like one shard of light. You're kind of identified as one shard of light. And when you're that one shard of light, you're sort of always concerned about how am I relating to the other shards? Are they closer or farther? Do they threaten me, or are they something I want? Do I love them or do I fear them? So it's a whole relational thing on the surface of this pond, and there's like sort of discomfort that comes with this. At first you may not notice it, right? Because you're more just concerned. Well, what is the pattern, and how is my shard of light doing compared to the other shards, and all of this sort of thing, and how's it moving, and so forth. But there's a bit of a discomfort that starts to come up through this because you realize, well, wait a minute. If I'm just one shard of light and I'm in this whole vast array of other shards and all these circumstances and forces I can't control, like I have no control. Not only that, I'm short-lived. My little shard of light is going to flash out because I see the other ones doing it, right? So it makes us feel a little unsteady, or maybe like we don't have a foundation or a stability. And we're just kind of worried, like, well, how long am I going to last? How do I relate to all these other shards? What the heck am I? At the same time, often we have an instinct that says, wait, there's probably something more going on here. There may be something more going on here than I'm seeing just with my analysis of I'm that shard and he's that shard and she's that shard and all and so forth. So we have a suspicion maybe or an instinct. This is great, right? This, in the human world, the analogy would be when we sort of pick up a spiritual sense. we pick up something that's like, okay, maybe there's something beyond this, just the way I'm processing reality, something bigger, something more subtle, something more vast, something more intelligent. I don't know, but it's something, yeah? So when you pick that up, it's often simultaneous. If you're really honest with yourself, you may find like, yeah, it is unsettling. There is some kind of sort of suffering along with this identity with that one shard. This would be pretty basic Buddhism. The first noble truth of Buddhism, life as usually lived, is suffering or unsatisfactory. And the second part of that, and they have to come together for this process to really start to propagate. The second part is a suspicion that it's not really the whole picture I'm seeing. There's something I'm missing in the way I'm processing my life right now. So with those two together, it leads to a certain kind of curiosity. So in what I talk about, maybe I could talk about it as being a curiosity that leads you to naturally inquire, to naturally ask really fundamental questions. Like, your parents never told you to ask these questions. Your teachers told you not to ask these questions, like why? Who am I? But something in you says, well, wait a minute. Maybe I should actually find out who I am if I'm going to be so certain about how I fit in with all these other beings and so forth. Maybe I should look deeper. What's actually going on here? So this nice cultivation of curiosity comes out of this experience, yeah? So then you start noticing the patterns on the surface. You're like, well, wait a minute. They're all sort of made out of a similar, all these beings, these light beings, they're all made out of a similar substance, this light. It's kind of all the same, yeah? Like my shard and your shard and her shard, and they really seem like they have a similar substance, even though they seem distanced and temporally related somehow. What if they're the same? And again, this starts, what if they have some similarity or some interconnection, or there's some substance underneath all of this? And again, this arises from that natural instinct that maybe something isn't how I thought it was, right? So now we're starting to really look like, what if I am that light somehow? Or what if that light is something more about the truth that's going on than one specific shard, yeah? And often this is in spirituality when we come into contact with teachings of consciousness, or the idea of interconnection, or even wholeness or spirit, right? That there's this sense of maybe it's something that's really is kind of connecting everything together, or is a substance behind all of this, or something, and that feeling, again, increases our drive to inquire. It increases our curiosity, our fascination with this process. We realize, there's something actually happening here, yeah? And then, as I kind of describe in my book, for whatever reason, the conditions line up, the breezes slow down enough, maybe through spiritual practice, meditation, we calm the mind down enough, we get curious enough, and there's a moment where the water just becomes still on that surface of that pond. And all of a sudden, we see the whole moon, right? Oh my God, all of those shards were never separate entities. They just appeared that way for some reason, but this beautiful globe I'm looking at, this moon, luminous, whole, complete. It's just what it is. And the most important part is that instinct that something was off, and the instinct that I wasn't seeing the whole picture, that's really validated here. You feel it in your bones. You feel like, whoa, that's different. It's different, but it's more natural. It's more real. It's more obvious. All of those concerns I had about, being separate and being short-lived and all that, those were based on assumptions I was making that aren't true. And so it doesn't necessarily solve your problems. What it does, it shows you the problems weren't there in the way you thought they were. And now this experience of wholeness, this experience of the luminous moon on the surface. So this I'm in an analogy is what I would call an awakening, like a true shift in identity. And it's a big deal. It's a really big, when this happens to people, it's pretty much the biggest event they would probably describe in their life as far as the deep insight and the implications. Now, sometimes it's a really big deal emotionally and experientially with a lot of like mystical aspects, and sometimes it's not. But it's always rather significant. And when I talk to somebody about what actually changed, they know. And it's something at the level of identity. So again, now you're not taking yourself to be this little shard of light. Now you're sort of experiencing yourself as the whole of the moon. And that's really astounding. And it calms you down a lot. It relaxes you a lot. It makes you feel like you're living in a much more vast experience much more fluid experience, and you're less self-defensive, less self-doubting. And often for a period of time, weeks to months, people have this, what I call honeymoon period, where it's not just less, it's like none. I mean, you really feel pretty liberated. That's not the end, by the way. That's the beginning of this journey.